All right, välkommen allesammans. We have a very special guest today. It's Pagan from Rune Guidance of the Norse. We've known each other quite a long time, and she has some experience in a lot of different aspects. I cover more of the sources, but she is someone who is actually practicing it and has a long tradition of it. So we've got a great interview for today. So thank you for coming, Pagan.
Uh, Thank you for having me.
Yeah, sounds good. So we're speaking about Trolldom today. What for the general viewer that has maybe not heard of it before, what would you say Trolldom is?
So, the classic definition of trolldom is the folk magical and healing practices of Scandinavia. And that includes a very broad paintbrushing of ideas, but there is at the core a traditional and classical way that it is taught and passed on generation to generation.
Yeah, and that's kind of that leads on to the next question too. How would you go about learning this if people are interested? Is it kind of a private community, or are there books or a larger tradition that they could search online to learn about this, or what's the best way to go about that?
Yeah, actually, it is kind of difficult. It's a little more accessible nowadays, since my mentor put out this book in 2015, I believe, and that's Johannes Gorbeck. Um, it is not a closed practice. Anyone can learn trolldom. Anyone can be a practitioner of trolldom, but you do need to learn it from someone who is steeped in the tradition. And it's kind of well, it is a spoken rule truly in trolldom that you don't actually teach it until your mentor has kind of given you the okay. It's just a matter of respect to the tradition, to who you learned it from, and the way we pass it on. So hopefully that makes sense.
And I remember that, and that's a great book, by the way, one of my favorites. Everyone should pick it up. I recommend it to everyone,
Yeah.
really. But I remember something in there. It's like some kind of unspoken rule too, that you should not teach it to someone older than you. It's supposed to be taught to someone younger, and also not someone of the same gender. Is that right?
That is true. That is the traditional way. However, those things have kind of been softened over time now that we have the internet and more access to other people. So, for instance, I'm actually older than Johannes,
Oh yeah.
but yeah, but he is much older in the tradition than I was. So, therefore, when I started to want to really dig deep into my practice and learn more than just what my family had taught me about trolldom and what my father had taught me and my mother, he was one of the only sources that you could find. So some of that is softened, but traditionally, yes, you're absolutely right. And Johannes and I were talking about this morning, actually. It is funny that a lot of times there seems to be a better melding when a female practitioner teaches a male and vice versa. I know, having that from my father and also Johannes, there's something there that kind of does that Freya thing, that just makes it a very fertile and seems to work. So there's reasons why these things are put in place because they work better,
Mhm.
and that's why they're traditionally used. But the thing about trolldom is there's not always these hard, steadfast rules that people long for. Well, if it's not in a source, then if it's not written down by Snorri, then you can't. There are flexibility and using your intuition to be able to go forward. But generally, yes, you're right.
Yeah, and I like especially what you said, and that's why I really like Johannes's book so much, because it gives you, it's not just kind of new age, esoteric type stuff with all
No.
that stuff. It actually tells you where these spells and traditions came from, and it's coming from starting, I don't know, about the 1400s to even the 1900s, but a lot of them we know can date back to much older pagan times, and we're going to speak about that in this video. But the second question is, what would you say, how would you say Trolldom is similar versus different to other Norse or global magic traditions, like, the Thaidr, Galdr most people know of? Is it more based around healing? Is there any kind of similarities to the shamanistic tradition, Wicca, divination, all that kind of traditions around the world? What would you say are the similarities and differences, the main ones at least?
Okay. So as far as Wicca, that being a religion, Trolldom is not a religion. As a matter of fact, Trolldom can be practiced independently from Norse paganism. They are not mutually exclusive. There are many Trolldom practitioners who really aren't practicers of a devout type of Norse paganism or Norse spirituality. However, yeah, they are intertwined, but it is not a religion. So that answers that aspect. As far as other traditions, similarities, and differences, primarily Norse spirituality in general, and I'm going to include Trolldom. Trolldom are in that, is animistic. It's an animistic practice. And when you think about animism and all these different folk practices all over the world, they all do kind of go back where they started, and pretty much everything starts with animism. It's how we relate to the earth and our surroundings. So there are similarities that you will see in maybe hoodoo, or in some of these practices, like the Saxon magical practices. There are similarities, because at heart, and I'm not a specialist in hoodoo by any means, so I don't mean to offend anyone if they're like, no, why are you speaking on that? But at heart, things are animistic, and we all have the sky, we all are part of the same earth, so there are going to be similarities that way. Where Trolldom is different, and a lot of people don't want to accept this in the Norse pagan community, and are very shocked to hear this, is Trolldom is not really based heavily on the deities, on the gods, and on the mythos. It's really not. It is much more based on earth spirits, or the Vetter, or the Tomta. These types of spiritual beings are much more, I don't like to use the word important, but are much more prevalent in Trolldom. Because look at the name itself, Trolldom, Trolldamr, that is the jurisdiction of the trolls. And so troll meaning things that are magical, things that are unexplained. So yes, that can include deities, and there are some Trolldom formulas that reference Freya and Frigg, also Open and Thor. But apart from that, you're not going to see, oh, I got all these, so-and-so told me this god told me that. Maybe that happens to some practitioners now, which I'm not criticizing, but that's not part of the traditional way that Trolldom has come about. So the earth spirits are much, much more important, and the ancestors. So that's where it's different in people's perception. They're kind of surprised to learn that when they come into the tradition. That being said, everybody's experience of where they live and their environment, you're in California, I'm in Florida, people might say, oh, well, that's kind of similar. It's really not. The spirits that are going to be around you are different than the spirits that are going to be around me. Now, some of us lineage-wise are going to bring the traditional Scandinavian spirits. I was raised in a first-generation Swedish home. You're Norwegian. So, of course, some of those things are going to come with us wherever we go. But then we need to consider what's around us where we are now. And that's something that people also forget too. So I think that's kind of how Trolldom is different. But one last thing, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of wordy, but
That's
this
great
is what
stuff.
I do.
Great question. Keep going.
all day long and love doing it, so I can talk for hours. So you cut me off at any time. But one other thing that's different about trolldom is you need to shut up. Trolldom is a silent practice. And people love to yep on TikTok and Instagram and tell all their things and say all this. And that's not what it's about. The less you speak, the more you know. The more you know, the less you speak. That is definitely a trolldom thing. So not sharing, even teaching formulas or spells or prayers, however you want to word the terminology. If I'm teaching you a trolldom formula, I'm not going to really use that formula again myself because I just gave you the power of it. Now, there are certain things I can do if you're with me to kind of keep power for myself too and share with you because I really trust you. But in general, things that I may share, things that Johanna shares that are just open for the world to hear, we're not going to use anymore because that power's been handed over. So that's a difference too. Keeping quiet.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense. What would you say then is kind of the most common type of practice in Trolldom? I know it's a lot of the people who are doing it professionally, at least. It's a lot of healers involved in that stuff. But what would you say is the most? Is it that, or is there other more private traditions that we don't hear about? What's the most common kind of effect that people are trying to produce with Trolldom?
Yeah. I think it goes with what is your definition of healing. In Trolldom, the definition of healing is removing curses. Or maybe some people need their ass kicked and need a curse to aid someone from healing from the past. So I would say primarily healing, but that's not just a physical body thing. It is very much working with the supernatural to have the supernatural influence the physical, as opposed to I'm influencing the physical myself. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
The way
Yeah.
I described that? I'm going to
Mm.
go to spirits and energies that are part of the tradition to have them affect the physical world, as opposed to me saying I'm going to operate on you or I'm going to whatever. That being said, there are practical things, have some chamomile tea with honey, and that will physically, aid your throat. Of course, there's that type of tradition too. But the magic of trolldom is working with the spirits to get things accomplished. And that's amazing because that can go anywhere in the world or in the universe. You're not limited to what is right in front of you. It's like internet before there was internet.
And I love that description too. That's what kind of, we're talking long back in the days, when I started to actually believe in these things. When you think of magic, like a Harry Potter thing, like someone says a spell and like I'm the magic, I'm casting the spell, or this wand is shooting it out, like that is, for most people not very believable. But when we get into understanding that most of it really is, it's not you doing the magic, it's you somehow manipulating spirits or energies or whatever things, energies there are around, you're manipulating them in some way to act on your behalf. So it's them that's doing the effect. Whatever you believe that to be, whether that be spirits, whether that be nature, whether that be the animistic, spirits of a tree or a leaf or all these other items that you use in the Trolldom tradition. It's that those are the things that are actually doing the effects that we want to.
Yes, 100%. And I teach Introduction to Trolldom on my Patreon. It's a level on my Patreon at runeguidance.com. But in that class, one of the first things I say is Trolldom, and maybe this is another difference in the previous question that you asked me. Trolldom is about relationships. The whole practice is all about relationships. First, you knowing yourself. That's where age is a really good advantage because you tend to have been through so much. You understand who you are and what you're about. but also your relationship with everything around you, not just the humans, the bugs, the trees, the leaves, as you said, and building those relationships in a respectful way. Hospitality, one of the number one rules in our belief system religiously, right? Going back to pre-Christian Scandinavia, hospitality was everything. It's the same thing in Trolldom. You need to be hospitable. You need to be giving. You need to have offerings and sharing and building relationships with that tree in front of your house, with that bush behind your garage or whatever. So it's all about relationships. And that's what makes it really powerful because, hey, I got friends in high places. You are so much more than just you. You have good relationships with beings that can really do things and make things better or worse, depending on what you like to do.
And that's one thing I wanted to ask. One thing that people will notice about Trolldom is the amount of items that can be used in it. Like these crazy random items that you find in nature that I've never quite understood. I'd like to see your thoughts on it. It can be something like very specific, like taking a raven's heart and burying it in an anthill, and then it turns into a powerful ring. Or it could be like taking a herb that a frog brings in its mouth, or like very specific items that you would find around in the nature. What is kind of the significance of that, and how how do you think that all started, really? How far back does that go? How do you think people figured this out and eventually believed in these things and used it in their practice?
I think we're a lot smarter than people give us credit for. I think all that stuff about, and this might be, maybe some of your listeners will be really offended at what I say, so I apologize ahead of time, but I think, aliens building megalith structures and all this type of stuff is a bunch of bunk. We had the ability to do things for so much longer, so much more farther back in the past than we realized. We just didn't all of a sudden get smart and figure things out. This has been going on a very, very long time. And because most cultures started out animistic, they had relationships with things around them. I think the significance of Trolldom for these types of, weird things, boil a white snake and this type of stuff is to get you to go, well, oh my God, I don't have any white snakes around here. What do I do? It forces you to begin a relationship with something that is around you. And that's going to be more powerful than just some rando thing. A lot of the black books and the smart booker, and that's a whole nother topic, a lot of them have formulas that are halfway written. They're only partially done. Why is that? Part of that is because you don't want to give away all your secrets, but part of that is it forces the reader, the future practitioner, to use their own magic, to use their intuition. Don't be spoon-fed by like a baby your whole life and, oh, I have to have this herb and mix it this way and turn to the left and jump up and down. Okay, a lot of those are there on purpose to make you think. Why? Why is it important? What makes an herb that is brought to me by a frog different than one I just find? It's got to be definitely more rare. It's a more unusual thing that a frog would. So you have to read between the lines. Scandinavians traditionally are existential thinkers and very much in their heads and kind of overthink things. And that's what Trolldom is about. It's reading between the lines, and it's not just about the A, B, C, D, I'm going to do this, and poof, something magical happens. That's baby magic. And Trolldom is much, much deeper. You must rely on what's inside of you a lot more with Trolldom. And that's scary for many, many people because they're not connected to it.
And daunting, right? It sounds strange to us today. Like, okay, well, where do we even start? We're out in nature looking for all these things to use. How are we going to test this out? But what people don't understand is this is all humans previously in time had. They didn't have TV or iPhones to scroll on when they're bored. Yeah, they had
Right.
tens and thousands of years to test with these things over many generations. Just they had much more knowledge about the things in nature around them, and they can test out whatever they wanted. And maybe they tested out 200 different herbs to before they found out which one worked best. So it's hard for us to understand today, but it's definitely it makes sense when we think about that.
Well, sure, because you're eating, you're killing animals and eating them. You're being exposed to different hearts and different bones. Where
Mm.
today many people go to the grocery store and they buy something. So, yeah, you're exactly right. The lifestyle was different, so the exposure was much different, and that made a difference.
Mm. What this is the main question, main topic that we were going to cover today, and we can speak about this for a while. But the main question is, how do we date? What kind of these Trolldom practices can we date back to the Viking Age, or even much before the Viking Age?
Yeah.
And even going back similar to the most ancient times, hunter-gatherer type practices around the world. What kinds of things can we see there? Yeah, I have a few that I can list too, but you can go ahead and start anything that you feel that we know was done much older than, say, the 1500s.
Yeah. Well, I guess trolldom in the way that it's written down, as you said, started in the medieval times. That's when it was written down because that's when people started to write things down. But that's not when it was created, and that's not how when it started, right? So people before that, everything was done orally. We had a huge oral tradition, and we still really do have a huge oral tradition. This is incredibly frustrating to people who can't seem to understand that because they don't have
Hmm.
relationships with people or with their ancestors to understand that people shared things. So many people don't even know their grandparents' name, which blows my mind, but it's just how it is, at least over here in the West, as opposed to, other parts of the world. But yeah, I think that the basis for these things going way back and in trolldom, something that might actually carry over, well, we know carries over, is the traditions and the rituals that you would find in the thing. The thing is, there are certain rituals that are done in trolldom today that were done in pre-Christian Scandinavia and before things were written down. Taking hazel branches and putting them in the ground and encompassing the area that the thing would take place. That's still a huge thing in trolldom, working with hazel twigs and making boundaries. Another thing, if someone was called to the thing, there was a which we call stemma. Stemma is justice needs to be served to someone, and the thing's going to call them, the thing being a council of wise leaders who would pass the laws and pass the judgments on things. They need
And
to
these were
call
also
somebody.
sacred places too, right? So that they
Yeah,
were, and we know that
exactly.
from the sagas and older sources too. That's one thing we
Yes,
can know for sure. They had
yes.
their meetings and also their rituals, like whether it be law or some sacred spiritual practices. They had them in the same places.
Yes, and it's the same places that people go to today in Trolldom, the rock pits and sacred
Mm.
groves, these things, and they're the same places. And we know this by the place names that the ancient ones met at. So something that would carry over, for instance, calling somebody to the thing, executing judgment, and stemma would be you first go to their bedpost and tell them that they're wanted to be seen. Then you would pronounce it again in their doorway or their threshold, and then you'd announce it again once they came to the thing. This is something that is still done in trolldom today. This is carried over from that ancient time, and kind of an unbroken line of certain rituals that take place, even
Mm.
though it's not written down.
Mm. Yeah, and some, I mean, In Scandinavia and other places in Europe too, people are a bit lucky with that because we know where these sacred places were, where a lot of these old burial sites, a lot of these old mounds and groves and waterfalls and wells, springs, all these things that we know were actually sacred places in pagan
Yeah.
times. We have records of this. But what would you say to some people who are living in other places in the world,
Mm.
like us in America right now? How would someone go about finding the proper places so that they would get the most from?
I think, that's a really good question. It's something that I grapple with a lot with people living in America. And I mean, I've been back and forth to Sweden and Norway so many times over my lifetime. And you find rune stones erected on the side of the road when you're going to pick mushrooms. It's so easy there. I think this is where we get a lot of conflict with people in other traditions where they're like, hey, that sacred area is part of our culture, our
Mm.
tradition. Why are you attracted to it? Because our our traditional people were not here until 100 years ago or 200 years ago, apart from the Vikings that came before Christopher Columbus. But you know what I mean. I grew up in Niagara Falls. That is a frickin' sacred place. I don't care if you're an indigenous lineage to the Americas or not. There is no way you can be in Niagara Falls and not feel it. And that's because Earth is for everybody. Tree spirits are for everyone. They, you know what I mean? So you have still so much here in the Americas that you can view as sacred. I have a pond behind my house, which I post about all the time. I have an alligator, a physical alligator that lives there that is a protective spirit. I speak to those spirits. I give them offerings. It's not listed anywhere that this is a sacred site, but I know it's a sacred site. I think part of this again goes back to feeling and tradition and being around something that just strikes you like, why is that pile of rocks there? I don't know, but I'm attracted to it. You have to be in touch with yourself. And that gives you the ability to then listen and connect. You wouldn't just walk into somebody's house and not acknowledge them and just, you know, plop yourself down and start doing your thing. That's somebody else's house. What are you doing? It's the same thing with nature. No matter where you are, observe it. Be mindful of it. Who is here? What spirits are here? What animals? What energies? And so just basically not being selfish and think outside of yourself at other things, and those things will be shown to you. And maybe that's kind of woo-woo sounding, but I really believe that that's the truth. You don't have to be in Scandinavia to connect with nature. It should be wherever you are because you are an earthling.
Mm.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, yeah, makes complete sense. You touched on it a little bit there. So most people, even your name included, so I'm assuming to the runes. This is something we
Yeah.
can date back to pagan times. We know they were used for various spiritual and magical purposes. How does that relate to Trolldom, and how often does that show up in that tradition?
I don't see how you can separate trolldom from not working with runes. Because Trolldom connects us, and this is why it's so important. It connects us to what maybe little magical practices we do know, and there's more than people realize from the past. Trolldom is the carryover from the vulva, the vitki, the carryover from the ancient ones that were healers, things that remained from them, which we lost so much, and we realize that. But there are some things that remain, and they were preserved in Trolldom. And so runes are one of those things. Uh, I am a rune caster by trade. That actually helps pay my bills. And that's different than, pulling a rune out of a bag and, placing it like a tarot card or something. I'm not criticizing that. That's a more contemporary way to relate to that. But what I was taught was traditional casting, and their energies, well, basically, we believe that those symbols are possibly at one time were even sounds and spirits that were then engraved to be able to have some understanding and to communicate to someone else what it meant. That's a whole nother thing, I realize that, but anything magical in Scandinavia, runes included, is going to somehow be rolled into Trolldom because, again, it is the jurisdiction of the magical Scandinavian magic. So they are a big part of that, and it makes me kind of sad to see how runes are used nowadays. But I also understand that people learn from the internet and they learn from social media. They're not taught the right way, and so in a way, I can't hate on people for what they don't know. They're trying to understand these things, these tools, and we have so many in Trolldom, yes. But yes, they're an important part of Trolldom. I kind of rambled.
No, it's good, and you can see that too in Johannes's book as well. They're not like it's not like carving runes, but they have tons of them in there that are they're usually the Latin alphabet, right? But it's the way it's written out and the types of objects it's written on, and some of them are even called like runebrev, rune letter. So it's still there. It's just sometimes more the Latin alphabet is used than runes, but we can still see that in the archaeological finds that runes were used like very late on, up until the 1800s even.
Oh,
so
yes.
Definitely there. Just the kind of explanations are not there like most people want to, like most people are looking for, unfortunately.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that. You're exactly right. That's exactly how it is.
What about the Sami tradition? How closely is that related to Trolldom? We know that the Norse would go to the Sami mostly for their magical purposes, but it was a little bit different types of things. It was more. Some people compare it more to like shamanism, and that's kind of what the family that the Sami is in. They're in the Finno-Ugric family, the same type of shamanistic type practices that you would find in Siberia. But is there any correlation to Trolldom and the Sami practices, and maybe even further east, like Siberian shamanistic type practices in there?
Yeah, and this is also another topic that some people just don't want to hear and don't want to accept. But Trolldom and Sami magic are like this. They're so intertwined. Now, yes, there is a difference, and you're absolutely right. There is more of the journeying, the drumming in the Sami, like you said, the Finno-Ugric traditions of the East. But we have to understand, for about 500 years or so, Finland was part of Sweden. And so, scratch a Swede and there's usually a Finn underneath. So the saying goes. I know I'm a large part Finnish as well as Swedish, but it's all through my Swedish line. And that there was a lot of racism about that back in the day, and a lot of resistance to acknowledge that. But this is before borders. This is before countries. This goes back, like we were saying previously. We're talking like the Beaker people and the battle axe people, and there's evidences of these graves being intermingled and next to each other. People exchanged ideas with their neighbor next to them, around the bend. It wasn't like, oh, you're this, you're that, and there are these lines and divisions. And so there was such a beautiful meshing and intermingling in the past, before everybody got racist and was like, you got to go to boarding school and all that type of stuff that happened in Scandinavia. But before, in pre-Christian Scandinavia, it was very much combined and respected, and much of trolldom is totally influenced by the Sami traditions. For instance, the journeying in the Sami tradition, we kind of call mind rooms is the English term if you wanted to translate it exactly, and it's kind of what we learned from the Sami. Much of the modern day vulva or vala, we say in Swedish, um, are traditions that come from what we learned from the Sami. So it's very much intermingled. And, you can go back, like if you ever do those DNA tests, which a lot of that's just bunk, it really is. But, um, it shows like my dad's lineage going to Siberia. Like, that's weird. We didn't know about
Mm.
that. Where does that come from? And that's because that migratory people came over. And the same time you had the hunter-gatherers moving into Scandinavia, we're talking 10,000 years ago, and they intermingled. It wasn't a big issue for them. So yeah, it's definitely combined. I don't know if I answered that question exactly the way you wanted. As far as specific things, we don't tend to use the drum so much in
Mm.
trolldom like you would in the Sami magic, although I do, because that's part of my lineage. So as a trolldom practitioner with traditional trolldom, I also incorporate things that are important to me. One thing I huge on for healing and for meditating, getting into a meditative state, is bone tapping. It's just something that came to me naturally. The ancestors, call it whatever you want, and I use this, and I can't. It's weird. I can't even tell you how many people are like, "Oh my God, it makes me feel so much better listening to it." And I'm using alligator bones. Well,
Mm.
that's not Norse, but that's what's around me.
Yeah, and
So,
it's these types of things too that we can also connect to other places in the world. Yeah, we don't have any Norse sources like that. We actually don't even have any Norse sources that drums were used actually, and we don't have any sources about
right,
bone tapping. But we know every culture in the world did things like this for spiritual
exactly.
purposes. So this is something that can be going back in Scandinavia all the way back to Neolithic times, even before.
Absolutely. A lot of trolldom it seems like it's modern and strange in the way that even when it started to go into Christianity to be preserved, many of the black books and trolldom things were kept by the clergy. The clergy used
Hmm.
them. They were actually the magical practitioners in the beginning before the church cracked down on them and said, no, 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 that we want you to do things our way. But yeah, so before all that, the traditions come from just being, like you said, a Neolithic or a Bronze Age animist. You're using
Hmm.
bones. You use
Hmm.
what's around.
How how different, I don't know how much you've gotten into like the Icelandic magic, but a
Mm,
lot of these famous things like the staves and the sigils and things like that, they
yes,
seem to be just like you said, they were more like incorporated in the tradition by the church actually. A lot of them have some similarities to these Solomonic type
yeah,
symbols, and they were some of them I definitely think have pre Christian roots, those staves that we find in Iceland. But we don't find so much of those staves and the symbols and that kind of Christian tradition in Trolldom. Do you have any thoughts on that as to why that is? Why the two countries, Iceland and Norway, Sweden, Scandinavia, why they kind of developed into pretty different magic traditions?
yeah. I do actually. We kind of in Trolldom call that the magic from the islands.
Hmm.
So Åland, Iceland, Greenland, those are the islands. Even, some of northern Scotland there. And they are things that developed because they were geographically different. They even in Iceland have all kinds of other gods and Norse, this god, this god, this god, where I honestly, growing up, from what I learned from my Swedish family, I didn't know some of them. I'm like, who's that? Where's that from? And so, as people migrated and were in different geographical areas, of course, they grew in their own traditions. So trolldom truly sticks to its, and I say Swedish. because at one point, a lot of Norway and Finland, they were under that rule, and Sweden was the last country to convert to Christianity. So the oral traditions remained longer. They held on to things longer, and they kind of refused to change many of the place names, even though there was pressure from the Christian church once they did convert. So yeah, I think Trolldom just kind of stays in its own lane as far as what was around it. And yeah, we do borrow some sigils and some of these symbols in the Icelandic magic. We do use them, and that is actually part of traditional Trolldom, but it's also looked upon as, oh, that's island magic. Just so you know what I mean? They kind of preface it that it wasn't necessarily right here in Sweden doing it. And I know I keep saying Sweden, but that's because my perspective on Trolldom, for the most part, is a Swedish perspective because it was preserved there for so long.
Absolutely. And Trolldom too, of course, practice in Norway too. Denmark,
Oh yeah,
they had their magic tradition too, but definitely a lot less than Sweden and Norway. And then,
yeah,
of course, Finland, a lot of the Trolldom spells were written in English, as you read in Johannes's book, but they were parts of Finland that were part of Sweden at the time, too. So it's all
yeah,
very close and difficult to paint borders like that. But
yeah.
yeah, is there any other I think I covered everything, all the questions I had. Is there any other subjects you would like people to know about Trolldom, or any works you would like to send them to, or suggestions, ways they can learn more?
I think the black books, the Svartböcker, that's very important. There's a lot. We have a lot of stuff from Norway that was preserved. It seems like every time you find a new thing that was found about Trolldom, or an old black book, which are basically journals that private people kept there, like grimoires, it seems like they're always from some Norwegian attic in a
Yeah, they're
barn.
found in
You
some
know,
old farm from the
they're
1800s, hid
always
away.
in a barn attic in Norway.
Mm.
But so good on you, Norway, for that. But there's a lot of information that it's the because it's a folk practice, it's a practice of the common people, and therefore listening to the voices of the common folk is how you learn it. So looking into that type of thing, and sometimes people, the prosetta, they consider that in a way a type of a black book, because you can use the knowledge you find in there, because it was primarily poetry, and that's what these books are. This one my father wrote and gave to me when I turned 50. He gave me this one, and then he died not too long after that. So I was like, oh dang, I'm glad I got that. But yeah, so looking into our magic books, which are books just written by the people, and you can get some compilations that you can purchase online of people who've done the research and combined a lot of these books into one thing in English for you to read. Those are kind of important. But honestly, I know I'm biased, but this, I would start with this. This really, really is. It was foundational in that this is one of the first, if not the first, English book that really concisely, in a generalized way, explains what the practice is, how to kind of get into the practice. And again, this has been around, I think, since 2015. And many of the books that are written now are actually students of this author. So, go to the source if you can, and do that. So that's how booking is good. Trolldom, though, really is best learned from a practitioner, whether you're doing it through video or you're doing it in person. That's how it should be passed on, because silence is so important. You need to observe it happening. You can't just be told. You need to watch it, absorb it, and then repeat it yourself. And that needs to be done by viewing it. So I think if you're serious, you should go to a practitioner to learn.
Yes, yeah, perfect. So that's a very, very well said. Yeah, Trolldom, I recommend to everybody. That's Johannes Goibeck too. He has a website and he has a practice too. In
Yes,
Göteborg, I think he is. And yeah, that's thank you for coming on, Colin, today. I will
yeah,
put the links to her stuff in the description below. She has a YouTube channel, she
thank
has a
you.
TikTok, and if you guys are near West Florida, you can visit her there too as well. So
Yes,
yeah, thank you for coming on, and that's all for today.
thank you. Tack så mycket.